Hey folks, welcome back. Time for a little bit more Starfleet Battles discussion. So, if you remember my introductory video, I basically recommended that newbies to the SFB system start out with the basic set, the advanced missions box after that, and then modules C1, C2, and C3, which expand the game with some new empires. But I wanted to focus in a bit more on some of the other expansions that, in my opinion, add a lot to the game, but also add a lot of rules and complexity. So they're better saved for after you're quite familiar with the game system and want some variety. But nonetheless, to me, they're really great additions to the game that deserve a kind of deep dive and a little bit of discussion. So here we are with Module C4. It's called Fleet Training Centers. And it's definitely one of my most favored modules for the SFB system. It's been around, I think it first came out in 95. So this is from the Task Force Games era, pre-ADB. But it's still using the most recent rule set, the Captain's Edition rule set. So everything is fully compatible with everything you would buy up to the minute in Starfleet Battles. So don't worry about that. But what is unique about this product is that it adds 9 new empires to the game. And they all have some really interesting and strange quirks to them. And the reason for that is that this module is based on the concept of each empire in the game using simulators for training. So we've seen that before in Star Trek, right? Kirk does the Kobayashi Maru, cheats the scenario, and it's a big famous story. So we know that Starfleet uses simulators for training. And it makes sense, right? Taking all your starships out for real-life war games would be complex to organize, would require all the crew to be involved, and it would be expensive and time-consuming. But if you're putting a trainee crew into a simulator, you can do that anytime you want, and you can fill that simulator with any kind of opponents you can imagine. Now, typically, you would put in simulations relating to real-life enemies or rivals in the galaxy that your intelligence services have informed you about. But what's interesting about Module C4 is that they take this idea to the next step and think, well, what if each empire used the simulators to train against enemies that probe for their specific weaknesses or that presented them with really specific and unusual challenges to prepare them for new situations? And that's what this module is all about. So we have 9 new empires in here, but they're all brand new, nothing like what you would find in the quote-unquote real-world SFB universe. And they provide totally new and often very weird tactical challenges. So first off, I'll give you a quick rundown of these 9 different empires, and then I'll run you through a quick summary of the new rules and systems that are added. Then we'll talk about the counters a little bit, and then I'll show you some of the SSDs for each of the new empires. So first off, you have the Frax, and this empire was actually responsible for kicking off the whole idea of Module C4 in the first place, apparently. The idea behind the Frax is that they're modeled on kind of modern-day wet Navy warships. So all the weapons on these ships have either FX or RX firing arcs, hence the name the Frax. They also have submarines, which are a new concept for SFB, and they're ships that mimic submarine warfare by staying cloaked and being able to fire while cloaked, which makes them very dangerous and very different from anything else you might face in the galaxy. They also have some other unique aspects like very robust fighter defense systems and rapid-fire missile racks. Then we have the Britannians. These are modeled after old-school Age of Sail wooden warships. So each ship is mounted with broadsides on either side of the ship. They have very little protection and very little firepower in the front and rear in the ship. Everything is concentrated on these broadsides full of disruptors and phasers. So you really have to change up your maneuver and tactics with these guys. Then we have the Shark Hunters. These were a simulated race created by the Romulans to be the cloaked ship's worst nightmare. So they have flash bomb devices that instantly expose a cloaked ship to lock-on and make them vulnerable. They also have wire-guided plasma torpedoes that can be guided even towards cloaked ships. And they also have an ECM device that protects them from seeking weapons, including plasma. So they're real rough for the Romulans to face. Then we have the Karis, which are basically spaceborne tanks. They have turrets on which their heavy weapons are mounted, and they can rotate those turrets as they move to change their firing arcs. They also have interesting weapons in their heavy turrets, which include capabilities like penetrating shields. And they can also fire gigantic Scud missiles, a clear reference to the real-life Scud missile, which do enormous amounts of damage to fixed targets and bases, and have cool things like built-in protection against damage and a lot of modifiability. Then we have the Flivers. There's only a couple of these in this product, but I'll show you how to get some additional ships for these guys. They have a unique capability called Hover Warp. This allows them to essentially use special hover warp movement points to move about in any which direction, to turn and slip slide, additionally in ways that other ships would find impossible. And on top of that, they also have a very unique weapon called the Hyperdrone, which is like a drone, but it moves at speed 640. So compare that to a standard so-called fast drone, which moves at speed 32. So these guys move 20 hexes every impulse, which is pretty crazy. So they create a whole new dynamic in play when combined with this high maneuverability. Then we have the Barbarians. These are a kind of blank slate race. So they have a series of templates in their SSDs for different ship classes, and then rules in the R section that enable you to fill out their various optional weapon and system mounts to mimic any race in the galaxy or even to create a new one to face. These guys were actually quite similar to a proposal for a ship construction module that had been talked about in the past for SFB, where you could modify ships in the game according to a point system. Apparently, these guys represent about sort of 90% of what that system would have been had it been published. Then we have the Triaxians, who I believe were invented by the Gorn for their simulations. And these guys are unique in that they move on 3 axes instead of just forward or backward, which makes them pretty crazy to use and to fight against. They also have a new type of plasma torpedo that can fire extra long endurance shots or more compact, shorter range shots with better warheads, stronger warheads. Then we have the Deltans, which were designed by the Federation simulation designers to be specifically oriented towards busting bases. So these are ships that have a lot of power, they have a lot of speed, but they have limited maneuverability. But they're fast enough and powerful enough they can move at full speed with fully overloaded weapons, deliver a huge payload into a base, and then turn off. So if you can hold back these guys while defending a fixed installation, then you must be doing a pretty good job. Then we have finally the Canadians. You can tell what their reference is because they're maple leaf shaped ships. There's only 2 of these guys in this product as well, and they're both maulers. And what makes them unique is that maulers typically have a very restricted firing arc in SFB. They can do a huge amount of damage, but only in a very limited firing arc to the front. These guys, because of their triple-pronged ship design, they can have triple that firing arc. You can fire in the same firing arc but 3 different directions. It makes them much more dangerous as maulers than a standard mauler. So that's the basic idea behind these races. They all offer a totally different kind of challenge, new weapons, new systems. A lot of them are really outlandish compared to what you would find in the regular SFB game, so they're a lot of fun to play. So let's go through a little bit. I'm not going to go super detailed into the rules here, but I'll introduce you to the major systems for each race. You can see that it's a pretty hefty rulebook here for this module. 96 pages, but of course a bunch of that is annexes and scenarios and ship descriptions. But we do have a number of new rules in here, so it's quite a lot of content. So if you're new to the game, I think this would probably be a bit overwhelming. But if you are experienced with SFB and you really want to mix things up, then I can highly recommend this because it certainly will make you think about the game in a different way. So first off, we have a rule for triaxian tridirectional movement. So you can see the basics here. Basically, triaxian ships and only triaxian ships can move in any of 3 possible directions, as opposed to 2 directions of normal ships. So they move in directions called forward, port, and starboard. But you can only move in one direction at a time, and you can make direction changes which are equivalent to doing a reverse direction for a normal ship. And instead of having a normal high-energy turn, they have a high-energy direction change. So they have this very strange ability to shift along these 3 axes, and that gives them a lot of flexibility in choosing what shields they are turning towards their target at any given time. So they're really difficult to fight for the Gorn, I imagine, who are not known to be maneuverable. And that's probably why they created these guys for the simulators. Then we have the hover warp system, which is for the flivver, which I described earlier. So it's pretty simple to understand at a basic level. Basically, the flivver ships have left, right, and center warp engines, which you'll see on other ships. But specific to flivver ships, they use their center warp engines to gain hover warp points. And they can only use center warp engine power for that. So they can purchase those hover warp points, and they can use them for a few different uses. Firstly, they can do hover slip, so you can move the ship 1 hex in any direction, but only during impulses in which the ship does not move by normal movement. So you keep your same facing, but you can slip the ship in any direction, which is pretty amazing. You can also do what's called hover back. So this is where you use a hover warp point during an impulse when you're scheduled to move, and you cancel the movement. That's something, by the way, you can do by spending power in Federation Commander, but it's not something you can so easily do in SFB. So it's very powerful here in this game. There's also the hover turn, so you can turn the ship 60 degrees to the right or the left. You can do this either when the ship has a move scheduled or when it doesn't have a move scheduled. And it doesn't have any risk of breakdown or anything like that. And you can also use it to boost the turn that you're doing anyway. So if you're going to do a normal turn, you can use a hover warp point to make it a 120 degree turn, for example. So there's loads of great stuff you can do with hover warp. It allows you to flit all over the board. And it says here that a typical Flivver ship has 40% of their warp in center warp. So you often have a lot of hover warp points that you can use for these little tips and tricks, which is pretty cool. It does take a little while to get used to it and figure out all the cool stuff that you can do with it, but it is very, very fun and makes them feel completely different from a regular ship. Of course, they have a lot of exceptions and interactions, but we won't get into that. Then we have, for the Frax submarines, their Axion torpedoes. So when playtesting the submarines for the Frax, the ADB people found that just allowing them to do things like fire drones while cloaked wasn't very interesting or threatening. But then they got an external submission for this idea of an Axion torpedo. So it's a close-range heavy weapon, which can be fired under cloak, does not void the cloak. And you can see here, here's the 2-hit table. So it really is quite short-ranged. Once you get beyond sort of 4 to 5 hexes out, your chances to hit drop below 50%, which is not great. But they do a decent amount of damage up close, 10 damage in hex 0, and then ranging down to 5 at hexes 9 to 12. They can be overloaded as well, but if you overload them, then it does expose you from your cloak for that impulse. So that can lead to you having giving a lock-on to the opponent, which is the risk, of course. And it also can do feedback damage to you if you fire it from close range. But it's a really cool weapon that does present a sizable threat. While it is short range, of course, when you're cloaked in SFB, it effectively protects you from damage from your opponent's weapons, prevents them from locking on with seeking weapons, and also effectively enlarges the range for their direct fire weapons. So you do have a lot of protection against incoming damage. And then you can put out quite a bit with your Axion torpedo. So it does produce a substantial threat. So it's very cool and unique experience to use the Axion torpedoes with your Frax submarines. They do also have a size modifier. That's actually for the X ship version. This is the normal table. So if they're firing at smaller ships, because bigger size class is actually a smaller ship in SFB, then they suffer from a lesser chance to hit. That's because in the fluff here, these Axion torpedoes rely on sort of gravitic effects, and smaller ships don't produce as much gravity, so they're harder for the system to detect. So it makes sense and adds a little bit of challenge as well. Then we also have for the Frax the anti-fighter defense. So this is a really cool and useful multifunctional system. So it takes up one box on the SSD, but it's effectively a combination of a phaser Gatling, which gives you 4 phaser 3 shots per turn, and a anti-drone system with 12 shots. So very effective to beat back drones, small craft like shuttles and fighters. But they're a pretty effective and powerful system to keep small ships and drones away from your Frax ships, especially the bigger ones. And it can only engage size 6 or 7 targets, so you can't use this effectively against larger ships. It's really just specialized for keeping small ships and drones away from you. Then for the Kari, we have the very cool kinetic cannon. So there are 3 levels of kinetic cannon, the heavy, medium, and light, and different size classes of Kari ships, or tanks, if you will, contain different sizes of these guns, and they are mounted on the turrets as well. They have 2 main modes of firing, which behave really differently. So you'll see on the firing table they have damage P and damage E. Damage E is for explosive rounds, and these just do damage in a totally normal way. If they hit a shield, they do X amount of damage to the shields, and they might bust through in the typical fashion. The penetrating rounds, however, work in a really unique way. So what you do is you tot up the damage from your volley of penetrating shots, and you sort of count across the shield boxes on your opponent, and you score 1 damage on the first point of shields, then you skip 4 shield boxes and count the next one, then you skip 4 more and count the next point of damage, and so on. And you go through their lines of shields that are still up. If you still have points of damage left after skipping 4 along each like that, and you have some points left, then those will become internal damage. So effectively, even if you have a decent amount of shield strength left, some penetrating shots will skip over a lot of your shield boxes and end up penetrating through and slipping some damage into your internal systems, which is pretty scary. It's not easy to score internal damage through robust shields for a lot of empires. You need to bust those shields down and then punch through with your heavy weapons. But the Kari can fire their cannons quite a lot. You can fire several times per turn, and they can fire these penetrating shots to threaten internal damage even from quite early in the battle, which makes them really interesting to fight and a lot of fun to play with as well. Then we have the bomb thrower. So this is for the shark hunters. These are the Romulan sworn enemies that were designed to make it a nightmare for cloakers. So the bomb thrower basically allows them to chuck out flash bombs. So they basically land in a hex, and then their sole effect is to expose a cloaked ship to lock on. And so as long as you have active fire control and you have a lab box available, then the detonation of that flash bomb will let you have the lock on to that cloaked ship. And then the shark hunters can grab hold of you, they can chuck their plasma at you, and it'll be a bad time. The shark hunters tend to have a lot of these, so they're not really all that useful unless you're fighting cloaked enemies, because that's the only thing they do. But if you are cloaked, then watch out. Then we have the hyper drones from the Flivers with their hover warp. These, like I said, are pretty interesting because they're kind of a mix between a direct fire weapon and a seeking weapon. Basically, they just travel at this hyper speed, 20 hexes per turn. Yeah, so they have a maximum range of 40 hexes, so effectively they're on the board for 2 turns. They can't turn, or they can't do high energy turns like drones or plasma torpedoes can. So you do need to keep your enemy in front of you or in arc from the launchers. But with hover warp, it's much easier to do that. So that's why there's a nice kind of synergy between the hover warp technology and these hyper drones. Once the hyper drone enters the hex of the target, it does 8 damage points right away. But as it's traveling along, the opponent can sort of stop you at the optimal point in his flight path to try and do defensive fire. So they can try and knock them down. I believe they take, 6 damage points to destroy? Yeah, each hyper drone is destroyed after receiving 6 damage points. So the Fliver ships also will have large cargo bays typically, which will store about 50 points of additional drones for each cargo space, I believe. So they tend to have large ammunition stores for these, but they're the main weapon for the Fliver, so they do fire out a whole bunch of these. So when you face the Fliver, be on the lookout for them hovering around, keeping their front ends pointed at you, and just unloading loads of hyper drones in your direction. Then, again, for the Frax, we have catfish drones. So these are drones that themselves are actually cloaked and are launched under cloak, generally, by ballistic targeting. So they're only usable by the Frax. Basically, they have the benefits of being cloaked, which means that they're much more difficult for your opponent to shoot down, which is great in and of itself. But also, they're convenient in that you can fire them off while you're under cloak in a ballistic trajectory, so they'll just go flying straight out from the ship. And then if they acquire a target within a certain distance, then they will pick it up and pursue it. I think it has to be, within 2 hexes of an eligible uncloaked target. It will acquire that target and pursue it on its own. So it's another way that you can be presented with extreme danger from a cloaked Frax submarine, which is pretty cool. Then we have the Frax missile racks, which are very easy to understand. These are basically missile racks that can fire very quick blasts of missiles. So a ship equipped with missile racks can launch 1 drone every impulse. So in essence, a unit equipped with missile racks can empty all of its racks in a number of impulses that is 4 times the number of racks on the ship. Cloaked ships as well can launch ATG drones, active terminal guidance drones, in other words, from their missile racks even while cloaked. So for those of you who aren't Kzinti players who often use ATG drones, these are drones that have a limited kind of self-guidance, so you launch them out. If you're under cloak, you can launch them out on a kind of ballistic trajectory, and then when they're within a certain distance of the target, they will pick up that target using ATG guidance and pursue it, and then they don't require you to use a drone control channel for that, so they're really helpful for Kzintis who want to build big drone waves. And it turns out they're also useful for Frax who want to fire at you while they're cloaked with rapid-fire drone attacks. Then we have the subspace guided missile. So this is from the Kari as well. This is basically, it's a missile, or a drone rather, that moves like a probe drone. And the interesting thing about it is that you can effectively, rather than being forced to always move closer to the opponent, as with a typical drone or a plasma torpedo, you can meticulously control the movement of these things. So you could, for example, maneuver it behind a target and then release it to operate on its own guidance and smack the target in the behind. So it's pretty cool, but it does require, it does have some restrictions. So, for example, you can't use erratic maneuvers. You can't control more than 3 of these drones at one time. So they do require more resources and attention to use because of that ability to move them so precisely. But it's a pretty cool option for the Kari to have. Then we have the Scud missiles, another Kari system. So these are giant missiles for bombardment. Their speeds match up with the speeds of regular drones. So during a given era, they will follow the drone speeds at that time, either 12, 20, or 32, depending. They take a massive 24 damage points to destroy. And the basic Scud missile will do 96 points of damage, you can see here. Score 96 points of damage if it hits its target. However, that can be reduced due to the missile's inaccuracy, and it can be reduced in favor of boosting some of its other properties, like endurance. But the missile has a few other useful properties. So it has a built-in anti-tractor field of 1, and you can increase that by reducing the strength of the warhead as well. It also has a damage reduction die. So when you fire a weapon at a Scud missile, after you determine the damage, you roll a d6 and subtract the result from the total damage. And you roll an individual d6 for every weapon that you fire at the missile. So there's really quite a lot of luck going into whether you can shoot these things down. Even if you fire a big barrage of stuff, a lot of that damage could be reduced by the damage reduction die, and you end up with the Scud still trucking on towards its target. So these guys are really interesting to fight against, much different from a normal drone. And they do certainly spice up base defense scenarios, because they're very, very dangerous if one of these giant things smacks into your precious installation. Then for the Triaxions, we have the Type A multi-purpose plasma torpedo launcher. So this is just basically a really flexible Plasma S torpedo launcher, which has these additional abilities to fire long-range torpedoes. So they have more stable warheads, so it takes 3 points of phaser damage to reduce the warhead by 1 point. And they also last for longer, as you'll see in a moment on the firing table, but they have lesser strength warheads. Conversely, you have the short-range torpedoes, which cost 2 additional points of energy. The long-range costs 1 additional point, by the way. So they have more powerful warheads. However, they're more unstable. So every point of phaser damage reduces the strength of the warhead by 1. So they're easier to drain down by phaser fire. But they do increase damage, and it's quite a bit, actually. So this is the firing table for the Triaxion Plasma A. You can see it can fire standard S's at 30 points, standard G's, standard F's or D's. But the SL, the long-range version, it starts at only 16 points of damage, but it stays with that strength for quite a long time and only drops down to 12 after 21 hexes, and then slowly peters out after that. So significantly more endurance on that one. Plus, you have the added bonus of the additional reduction of phaser damage against it. The short-range S, however, is boosted up to a massive 48 points, but it dwindles away to nothing after 20 hexes, and of course it's easier to phaser it down. And the same again with the GL and GS, so the GL is half the strength of the regular G, but trucks on for longer, and the short-range G has massively more damage at 32 instead of 20, but only lasts for 15 hexes. So it's really cool to have this flexibility for the Triaxions, and when you combine that with their triaxial movement and their general flexibility, it makes for a really interesting opponent. They can dart away around the board in unexpected directions, and they can pepper you with a variety of different plasma torpedoes that have lots of different behaviors. So you really have to be on your toes against them. Speaking of plasma, for the Shark Hunters, we have the wire-guided plasma torpedoes. There's lots of interesting rules in here, which I won't get into, but the basic idea is that by devoting some additional resources to guiding these things, you can use these against cloaked targets more effectively, which again is kind of the whole reason for the existence of the Shark Hunters. So they're pretty cool in that respect. And when you couple that with the Shark Hunter's ability to generate lock-ons by using flash bombs and stuff like that, really it becomes worse and worse for the cloaked ship waging war against them. Then for the Karis, again, they get a lot of new stuff, these guys. They have this interesting system called the Transmortar. So if you've been playing SFB, you're surely familiar with transporter bombs or T-bombs, which you can roll out the back of your shuttle hatch or transport into space, and they can do a little bit of damage or destroy a stack of drones behind you. Very useful things, and so they're limited carriage for each ship. However, the Transmortar, it allows you to essentially fire a T-bomb quite a long distance away from the ship. And they have here a little tracking card that you can use, so that the ship that fired it, where it was fired from, when you fired it, the target hex, and so forth. And basically, you can land these things in a distant hex, and it will behave as a small mine. So it just doesn't do that much damage. I believe it's just 5 damage, I think. Yeah, an M-bomb explodes as a mine, producing 5 damage points in the hex of impact only. Treated in all ways as a mine explosion. Ignores all electronic warfare effects. Cloak provides no benefit. The M-bomb affects the hex it's transported into and no other hexes. Damages everything in the hex except for other mines or anything on a planet or asteroid. So quite useful to bombard a stack of ships, coming towards you. There is an additional delay to the appearance of the mortar in the target hex, depending on the range. But it's a really, really useful thing to be able to chuck bombs, small mines, around the map at will. Very, very cool and very dangerous for cloaked ships, especially. And a really unique ability to add to the Kari's feel. And they really do, with all these new systems, they really do feel like a kind of an influx of modern warfare into SFB. It's quite interesting. You can also fire the Transmortars indirectly by having a second Kari ship kind of providing a sighting, and then you can fire your Transmortar to hexes that the firing ship can't actually see, which again is a pretty unique ability. Cool to try and use it effectively. Then we have the rules for the Kari turrets, which are actually really easy to understand. So basically, the turrets are clearly shown on the SSD. Everything within the circle on the turret is mounted on that turret and will rotate with it, but anything only has its firing arc affected if it's something that has a firing arc. So, 360-degree weapons or systems don't really change when they're rotated on the turret, but they might be there anyway. You keep track of the facing of the turret using these counters, which you'll see in a minute. And basically, you can rotate 60 degrees, the turret, at a time. And the heavy weapons on there will have a 120-degree firing arc in the facing of the turret. And you can do 60-degree rotations as long as they're 8 impulses apart. So you can do it multiple times per turn. And it doesn't cost any power, which is really great as well. Then we have the chaff throwers. These are another system for our friends, the shark hunters, looking for the cloakers. So basically, this is kind of like the chaff that you get for fighters, but it works on ships, and it actually functions quite differently. But it's used for a similar purpose. Basically, it generates a temporary blast of ECM jamming around the starship, provides substantial protection against incoming fire, and is really helpful against seeking weapons. But there's a limited number of charges. It says here there's a provision for creating these charges from ship's energies, but it really takes a long time. It takes 20 turns, so it's not really worth worrying about. They only cost a quarter point of energy to fire, but one thing to keep in mind is that when you fire the chaff, it affects your own weapons as well. So it is more a purely defensive measure. You won't be able to do much useful offensively while it's under chaff. Then we have the helo shuttles. These are another interesting aspect of the Shark Hunter ships. So they have shuttles that move like helicopters, so they can move in any direction from impulse to impulse according to their movement rate. So it says here, they don't use the normal facing and turn mode rules of almost any other units. Whenever they're scheduled to move, they can move in any direction, and none of these movements is considered to be a higher energy turn for any reason, and it can change its facing by 1 hex side every time it moves. So complete freedom of movement, basically, in a very unusual way. However, they still can be death dragged with tractor beams, and warp booster packs interfere with this helo shuttle ability, but it is a very cool thing. They can also carry flash bombs. So there's some complexities here about how you determine, whether a helo shuttle can carry flash bombs or not, stuff like that. But basically, you can have shuttles carrying a couple of flash bombs and use them for cloak hunting. And given their maneuverability, that makes them actually quite dangerous for cloakers as well. So then from here we go into all the ship descriptions. which as always are nicely detailed, and they give you, of course, the mini SSDs repeated for the different types of fighters. They recap as well some specific additional rules for the different races. They give you background on each one, the usual detail that you would expect, but the more important part here is if you want to play the Barbarians, make sure you check their R section, otherwise their SSDs will make no sense, because this is containing all the rules about what weapons and systems you can install on their many different option mounts. Now, the basic idea is that you will pick a suite of weapons that all come from a single empire and apply those to the different option mounts. Then you can change which type of warp power and stuff they have available. However, it also says that, you're in the simulators. You can ignore all that and mix and match weapons, or you can create your own weapons to add in. So really, the Barbarians are designed as a kind of make-your-own enemy, which I think is a really cool addition to the game system. Then we have our coverage of the minor races, so just our couple of lonely Flivers, Deltans, Britannians, and Canadians. Then we have scenarios, and quite a few of them at that. And then we have annexes, charts, and at one point we will have, boarding diagrams for those of you using Starfleet Battles Module M for Marines. If you're doing detailed boarding actions, you will need these as well. So yeah, a lot going on in that rule book. But it's all clearly laid out and easy enough to understand if you're accustomed to reading SFB rules, which you would be by the time you'd pick up this module, I expect. Now, for the counters, these are still the old style counters because this is a 1995 product. You can see that most of them are for the fracks here, these gray and sort of navy blue designs. They are very reminiscent of real-world Navy kind of silhouettes, which makes sense. And you can see the fracks really get full coverage all the way from the big battleships, battle cruisers, various types of cruisers, destroyers, frigates, PF tenders. We've got fighters, we've got frigates, we've got PF fast patrol ships, we've got various types of shuttles, all kinds of stuff for them. Enough to do a full campaign with them as a race, effectively. But we've only got 2 of the Lonely Deltans, 2 Flivers. We've got a few Britannians. We've got a couple of Dreadnoughts and some CAs and some shuttles for them. And a couple of shuttles and 2 different maulers for the Maple Leaf Canadians. And then we got a bunch of Karis. You can see that their names are derived from Soviet-era tanks. So you got the T-83, T-64, all that kind of stuff. Then we have their turret rotation counters to keep track of where their turrets are facing at any given time. And they do get some PFs in this product, as well as the full-size ships. Then we have a bunch of Shark Hunters, ranging from the Dreadnought at the larger end, down to some frigates and cruisers. Then we have our Triaxians with their very distinct outline with these 3 prongs. And they also get a decent selection from Dreadnought and CVs and CAs down to PFs. And finally, the Barbarians, which have a fairly generic outline, but they are generic ships, so that kind of makes sense. So there you go. Not the most exciting counters in the world. It'd be nice to see some updated ones at some point. Maybe we'll get those when they finally come out with the planned additional C4 modules. So the plan was to have a C4F where we'd get more ships for the minor empires, and C4R, which would have more ships for running campaigns for the different empires, and then C4X, which would have X ships for everybody. But none of that has come to pass so far. But as I'll show you, there are some new and cool things you can get for this module already. For the SSD book, you can see the overwhelming majority of stuff is for the fracks, the most popular race in the product. But we have a decent selection as well for the Karis, going all the way over here. And for the Triaxians and Shark Hunters, we have a decent selection as well. But the Barbarians get just a few kind of template SSDs, which fits with their nature. And then we just have a couple of ships for the 4 minor races. So I'm not going to show you everything. We'll just look at a couple of biggies, major interesting things for each empire. So we'll start with, here's a Frax Dreadnought. It's a pretty big beastie. 210 points. We can see he's got disruptors mounted. Of course, everything in the front with the FX firing arcs. We can see the anti-fighter devices, 4 of them mounted up front, along with the drone racks, which will function as missile racks for these guys. And even more anti-fighter devices and disruptors in the back. So they really are robust against fighter and drone attack. So there you go. That's a basic Frax ship. But there's quite a few ranges and classes here. We also have carriers for them, of course. They're fighters, being that they were invented by the Klingons, and their simulators are very similar to Klingon fighters, which is fair enough. And they do carry a number of drones. So let's check out one of the submarines so you can see what those look like. Here we go. Here's a frigate sub, so it's a smaller one. Just 60 points. Now, these guys, as you remember, are all about firing while cloaked. You can see they have 2 Axion torpedoes in the front. They also have a drone launcher, which will help them to fire ATG drones while they are under cloak as well, or their catfish drones. And they also have an AFD device here as well. So it's a small little ship, but still quite capable, and certainly can bring the hurt while it's under cloak, which makes them very scary to face, no matter who you are. And there's a whole range of different sizes of subs for the Frax. So we've also got a destroyer sub at 80 points, a war cruiser at 110. We're getting up now to 4 Axion torpedoes, which is pretty threatening. Light cruisers. Here is a submarine missile cruiser. So they have 4 Axions in the front, quite a bit more hull to absorb damage, and they've got 5 missile racks here, as well as a couple of anti-fighter devices and drone racks in the rear as well. So a lot of weaponry for them to chuck at you while they're cloaked. Then we're back into a variety of Frax carriers, and some more carriers. We have survey cruisers, we've got command cruisers, war cruisers, minesweepers, tactical transports. They've got maulers. They've got more drone war cruisers, war cruiser leaders. Basically all the major variants that you would expect for a fully fledged empire in the game. The Frax have it, which is really great. They also have PFs as well. So here's a Frax PF flotilla. They've got disruptors at the front, and they've got, what else do they have? Disruptor to the rear side as well. 360-degree phaser 1s, and some phaser 3s to the left and to the right. Then we have, then we're straight into the Karis. So here's a Kari Dreadnought, the T-10. You can see it's got a big old turret here with a medium kinetic cannon here mounted in the center. The turrets, interestingly, also have an additional armor facility. So the turrets have these armor bits here, and when they take incoming fire that's heading towards the direction of the turrets facing, then you can take the damage on that armor instead of it busting through to the systems on the turret. You can see as well that this turret, being it's a big ship, has both a medium and a heavy kinetic cannon. So it can fire quite a few shots off of this turret. And remember, it can rotate that turret 60 degrees every 8 impulses. So it really can bear on you before you know it. So you need to watch out where that thing is pointing. The Kari SSDs also have these turret-facing sections here, so you can keep track of where your turret is facing during any given impulse and keep that updated so you don't mix things up as well. So they're pretty cool. Then we have, again, quite a few varieties of ships for the Kari. So we've got battle cruisers. This one has a light and a heavy kinetic cannon on the turret. Then we have the T-80. We've got heavy cruisers with just the heavy kinetic cannon. We've got a Scud carrier, which has no turret, but has a bunch of Scud launchers. So this will be your kind of missile boat when you're going to take on a base. And you can see there's a huge space dedicated here for keeping track of your Scuds that you're launching out of these many launchers here. They also have a variety of useful specialized ships. So we've got war cruisers. We've got a war cruiser scout. We have a light Scud carrier with 6 launchers instead of 8. A light cruiser. We've got war destroyer scouts, which has sensors mounted on the turret, which is slightly odd, but there you go. Then we have the smaller ships, destroyers, frigates, frigate leaders, drone frigates, which mount drone launchers on the turret instead of the kinetic cannons. We have PF tenders as well. And here, just in a nice handy space-saving format, we have a Kari carrier group. So here we have a fighter carrier. Note there's no turrets here because it's focused on carrying these MiG-23 fighters down here. And we have 2 escorts as well. So these dispense with the kinetic cannons, and they just provide a whole lot of phaser covering fire, and they use Aegis systems to provide cover for the fighters and its carrier. So useful to have those all on one SSD. I like that kind of compact format, although it is a lot to look at. There's a lot going on there. So then we have our PF tender and the PFs themselves, fast patrol ships. So these are great. If you want to just get used to the Kari kind of using their turrets and the kinetic cannons, I would just bust out a PF flotilla and fly them around and get used to using the turrets. There's not a lot to keep track of on these little guys, so it's a pretty easy way to get into it. And they're pretty deadly as well because, they're only light kinetic cannons, but they still take 2 hits to destroy. And you're still able to fire a couple times per turn. And some of those penetrating shots are bound to do something annoying. So pretty cool and pretty fun to use right off the bat. Then we get into the Triaxions. Here is their big boy, the Dreadnought. You can see we've got Plasma Ds mounted on the 2 tips here. And then we've got Plasma A's in the 3 center portions here. So those are the plasma launchers that give you that huge array of different possibilities, which are really fun and useful to use. You can see, we've got our Type S, Type G with long and short variants. And of course, you've got plenty of pseudoplasmas as well to keep your opponent guessing as to when you fired a real warhead or not. And when you combine that with these many different types of warheads, your opponent will be cursing you as they try to figure out what the heck is flying toward them at any given time. So the Triaxions are really fun. Definitely recommend giving those a try. And trying to understand their maneuver is a challenge in itself. They also get a heavy cruiser, which has less boxes to its name, but still has 3 Plasma A's, which is highly useful. The Destroyer as well, which takes out the Plasma A's for Plasma F's. Then we have a Scout, which has special sensors, and just Type D plasma torpedoes. Then we have a PF tender, of course, and the Triaxion PFs, which are great fun as well. Again, PFs are a really handy way in Starfleet battles to get used to new ship systems in a small format. They blow up in seconds, but you do get kind of a little microcosm of how that new empire is supposed to behave. So I do recommend you can use these to take them out for a spin. Although in this case, these guys just have Plasma Fs rather than the Plasma A. So you might want to escalate pretty quickly to the larger ships to make sure you get used to those new torpedoes. And for them as well, for the Triaxions, we have a handy carrier group SSD. So once again, we have our reference for the new warhead strengths up here. We have some Caltrip fighters, which is a great name, by the way. But these fighters don't use the triaxial movement system, which is a little bit disappointing. I might try it with that just to see how crazy it gets. And then we have a strike carrier, which still has 3 Plasma A's, as well as the room for all these fighters, which is pretty cool, but less in the way of phaser defenses. Then we have our 2 escorts who make up for that by providing loads of phaser defenses instead of their plasma launchers, as you can see. So they've got Aegis, as you would expect from escort ships as well. All right, then we have one more war cruiser for the Triaxions, and we get into the Shark Hunters. So these are our anti-cloaking ships. So you can see right off the bat, the Dreadnought has loads of bomb throwers, 6 of them in the front. So they just love hunting for cloaks with flash bombs. They can just keep doing it. They've also got 2 massive Plasma R launchers and 2 Plasma S's right behind them. So they can fill the board with plasma as soon as they get a lock on. So they're really, really dangerous when you're cloaked. Plus they have lots of phasers around the edges as well, and they've got chaff throwers. So basically, if you're a Romulan, you'll find this big beast coming down the board, chucking flash bombs at you, trying to get a lock on. And when you fire your plasma, it'll chuck out lots of chaff to throw out huge amounts of ECM and screw everything up for you. While at the same time, they're throwing Plasma R down your throat, and you can't get away from it because you can't cloak anymore. So very, very scary stuff. But lots of fun to use, particularly if you really don't like Romulans. This could be very satisfying to play against your Romulan friends with these guys once or twice, just to get that feeling, that satisfaction. They also get a battle cruiser, heavy cruiser, the war cruiser, war destroyer, scout, and a frigate on the smaller end of things. And they get a carrier group SSD as well, another lovely space-saving device. So they do have fighters called the Harpoons. They mount Plasma Ds, I believe, and a couple of Phaser 3s. So here you have a strike carrier which has 12 spaces for fighters, but also still maintains 4 bomb throwers and 4 chaff throwers, as well as several plasma S's. And then you've got your phaser heavy defenders in the form of these 2 the escort war cruiser and the escort war destroyer, which is very handy. Then we get into the barbarians. There's not much to say about these because they are basically blank slates, so you'll need to refer to the R section rules for these, but you can see that you've got different classifications of option mounts. So you've got F for front, L, and R for left and right, obviously. And then you've got non-weapon options, these NWO boxes, and optional 360-degree mounts in the middle, which have to be phasers generally. And there's power options, so you can choose from AWR, APR boxes for that kind of stuff. So there's really a ton of flexibility to create interesting new opponents, even with familiar weapons. You can mix it up with different power systems and different non-weapon system options. So for the barbarians, you get templates like this for the Dreadnought class, heavy battle cruiser, heavy cruiser, light cruiser, destroyer, and frigate. Then we get into our minor races at last. So here we have a Flivver heavy cruiser. You can see they've got a lot of cargo storage here, which presumably is going to be loads and loads and loads of hyperdrones. And then they've got their 4 hyperdrone racks, which they can fire from. And you can see they take up multiple spots on the SSD here. So as long as they have boxes left, I believe they can still fire. And they have relatively limited firing arcs. So you need to make use of your center warp, your 12 points of center warp in this case, and use your hover warp points to keep your target right in that in those accessible arcs, and just pepper them with as many hyperdrones as you can. It's lots of fun to do, so highly recommended. Then we have for the Flivver as well a war destroyer, so a smaller and more compact ship with just 2 hyperdrone racks, but still plenty of storage for additional rounds, and it just has 6 points of hyperwarp. Then we have the Deltans. So we have a Hustler heavy cruiser. You can see they've got 4 photons lined up in the front here, which basically the idea is that they'll pump themselves full of warp energy, charge towards your base at maximum speed, and fire a full complement of overloaded photons, and then turn off, hopefully before you can catch them up. And that's basically their main thing. But they do have limited maneuverability, so regardless of their speed, they have a turn mode of 4, as you can see here. So even if they do slow down, they don't actually get any more maneuverable. But it's a decent turn mode at high speed. So it's a trade-off. Basically, they're designed to do one thing and do it well. Everything else, they're a little bit fuzzy. We also have the Hellhound Warcruiser for them, again, which is a more compact ship but performs a similar function. You can see, again, we've got 4 photons lined up in the front here, and once again, the restricted turn mode. Then we have the Britannians. Love these guys. So here you can see how everything's set up on the broadside. We have, in the left arc, we've got Phaser 3s, Phaser 1s, a bunch of disruptors, and the same again on the right. To the FX and the RX firing arcs, or RA, I guess, we only have a couple of phasers and very limited shields. You can see how small those are. So they say actually in the R section for these guys that it's effectively useless to play the Britannians against races that use enveloping weapons like Hydra and Hellbores or enveloping plasma torpedoes, because their front and rear shields will instantly get crushed and they'll just be destroyed. So you can sort of try and adapt them to that by building up the front and rear shields, or just don't play against those kind of opponents. But, against the Federation or other races that don't have such weapons, they're certainly an interesting opponent with all new tactics. So we also get for them a Dreadnought, which is a hefty beast at 215 points, and a heck of a lot of disruptors. The other thing that they can do, by the way, is they can hold their disruptor fire for free as well. So they really can unload full broadsides quite frequently. Then finally we have our Canadian Maple Leaf Maulers, and you can see that tripled Mauler firing arc that I was talking about. So basically, besides that, they just have a few phasers, and their real focus is on trying to sidle up to the enemy and fire off these huge blasts of built-up warp energy through one of these more flexible Mauler firing arcs. So pretty cool. Definitely interesting to see this shape of firing arc on the board as well. So we've got a bigger Mauler, and then we've got a smaller one in the Warcruiser format. So there you go. That's C4. Now, if you're like me and you read through this and was fascinated and immediately thought that you needed some more stuff for the smaller races, well, you're in luck. You can also pick up this guy. This is module P6, the Galactic Smorgasbord. This has an array of different stuff for SFB in it. This was also published in 95. But what you really want to look at is these sections here. So we have the Hispaniolan's, this section for module C4F and C4X. So a big chunk of this book is devoted to new material for module C4 Empires, which is great. So I'll just skip right to that. And by the way, this module is very cheap. You can get it in PDF form for just a few bucks, or you can order it direct from ADB. I believe it's still available as a Dead Tree product if you want it. So the Hispaniolans are a whole new race for the simulators. So they are kind of derivative of the Britannians. They're also an Age of Sail style fighting ship. They fire from broadsides, but instead of having disruptors, they use a new weapon called the proton torpedo, which is like a weaker photon that fires every turn instead of every other turn. They also have 2 warp engines instead of 3, and they use center hull instead of forward and aft hull, so it changes up the way damage allocation will work out for these guys. They also have reduced numbers of phaser 1s, but instead of phaser 3s, they have phaser Gatlings, which is better for up-close defense, which is great. What's really interesting, though, is that these proton torpedoes have a lot of alternate firing modes. So, of course, you can overload them. The base damage is 4. You can also fire them as proximity torpedoes, so they're only good out to longer ranges. And they will much more likely to hit at longer range, but they only do 2 damage. You can overload them for anywhere from 5 to 8 damage, depending how much energy you put in. You can suicide overload them, so you blow up the launcher and get 12 damage out of it. You can also do chain shot, hot shots, hot proximity loads, and grape shot as well. And they outline all this stuff here. I won't go into too much detail, but suicide overload's already explained. The chain shot, so it does 2 damage when it hits the target, but then there's a special procedure for allocating the internal damage that it does, if any. So 1 damage point from a chain shot torpedo that strikes a down shield is rolled normally. The second point will automatically strike one of the warp engines. So the idea of chain shot is you can kind of target the warp engines of the ship, which is pretty cool. Then you have hot shots. So these guys do an additional point of internal damage if it penetrates a shield, right? So if this shot manages to punch through a shield, you get some extra internals off of it, which is useful, but very situational. Then you have the grape shot. So you pay an additional point for these. But then if you strike a target with shields, it scores the standard damage of 4 plus 1d6 of additional damage, which is only shield damage. So if that extra damage takes out the shield, it's the leftovers, if there are any, won't be scored on the target's internals. So really useful for punching through shields. And then they give you a whole bunch of new ships to use with this new empire. So we have Hispaniolan Dreadnought. You can see they replicate the proton torpedo table, and they also give you some rules reminder text about the additional firing modes, which is great. This is the Dreadnought at 215 points, and you can see we've got the phaser Gs instead of phaser 3s, and then all these proton torpedoes up and down the sides. Just like the Britannians, we have very limited front and back shields. So again, they will be pretty much screwed over by enveloping weapons, so don't play them in those kinds of situations. We also get a Hispaniolan heavy cruiser, a war destroyer, and a set of war destroyer variants on a single SSD, which is really cool. So these you have these optional mounts here, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. And depending on which package you buy down here for these different options to fill in those boxes, you can get a different setup. So you can have it as a scout, and those 6 boxes become special sensors. You can have it as a minesweeper, where you gain 2 tractors and 4 mine racks. You can have it as a drone bombardment ship, so you get 6 drone racks. Or you can have you can replace them with barracks, cargo, and transporters, and add a bunch of boarding parties. So lots of options. Really great to have that for this simulator race as well. Then the real money for fans of the minor races from C4, you have a bunch of new stuff for the Canadians, the Flivers, the Britannians, and the Deltans, which is really great. So, for example, we have a big old Dreadnought for the Flivers. It's got a whole bunch of center warp, 18 points of center warp, and a lot of hyper drone launchers as well. In fact, 9 hyper drone launchers. It's very cool. We also get a set of War Destroyer variants for them. Again, they function just like what I showed you for the Hispaniolas, with different packages you can buy in. And we got a standard war cruiser with 4 hyperdrone racks. And then we have a little frigate with just 2 hyperdrone racks, but it'll still be very nimble with its 6 points of center warp for hover warp functionality. Then we've got new ships for the Deltans. We've got this War Destroyer with just the 2 photons here. Then we have a set of War Destroyer variants for them as well, again giving you that flexibility. And then we got a big old dreadnought with 6 photons up front, which is very scary if you're defending your base from these Deltan fleets. Finally, for the Deltans, we have the Bloodhound frigate, just a small guy. And then we get a bunch of new stuff for the Britannians. So beyond just the 2 ships in C4, we now get a war cruiser, a War Destroyer as well, and then a set of, you guessed it, War Destroyer variants, just like for the other races we've seen in this product, which is very helpful. And then we have a little frigate as well. Then we have more ships for the Canadians, although these are not maulers. They just use this odd shape and give some unique firing arcs to the weapons, which are a mix of phasers and disruptors in this case. They also have some plasma Ds as well. So they are starting to kind of flesh out the Canadians as more than just kind of novelty mauler race. They do have some particular weapon mix that they use, which is a little bit unique, and this odd shape and firing arcs as well. So that's kind of cool. Give them a little bit more personality. We have War Destroyer for them, and guess what? A War Destroyer variants page as well. So very, very flexible again. Finally, in this product, we have some ships that use X technology for the fracs. Now, some of the systems in C4 for the fracs, they do have X variants of the systems. But now here's some more additional X ships if you want to use X ships in your simulated battles against the fracs. So we've got an X Command Cruiser, an X Advanced War Destroyer, and then a Advanced Sub, which is really great to have as well. So some very powerful opponents for your X ships in the simulators. So a ton of great stuff here if you just spend a few bucks on Module P6. Highly recommended if you're a fan of C4. Then, if you're really hardcore and you want just a little bit extra, you can go on to DriveThruRPG or the other PDF outlets for ADB stuff, and you can pick up the Starfleet Times issues 11 through 15. They come in a package, so you can't not get them that way. You can't get them individually. But I think it's $5 for the pack. And then you'll find in issues 12 and 14, you'll have the R section rules and the SSDs for carrier groups, for the Canadians, and for the Flivers, which is great. So here I printed them off so you can see. The R section rules contain what you need to know for the fighters. The Fliver fighters do have hover warp, which is really cool. If you look very closely here, you can see that the speed, rather than just being a single number as it is for a typical fighter, it's marked as 12 plus 6. That means they have 12 regular movement points, and then they've got 6 hover warp points to do with as they please. So they're very, very nimble little fighters, and they can carry hyper drones as well. So the Fliver carrier is pretty menacing, lots of fun to use, and the fighters are pretty scary. So definitely worthwhile trying to fight against these. It's a good challenge. And then, of course, you've got the War Cruiser escorts and the Escort War Destroyer as well, which you can get either limited or full Aegis versions of those, depending on your points budget. So very, very cool. And the same again for the Canadians. So we then get these little guys, the C3 fighters for the Canadians, which carry Plasma Ds on board. And you get a Maple Leaf Strike Carrier here. And it's Escort War Cruiser and Escort War Destroyer. Very, very cool. So this is really only if you're hardcore into C4, because it is another $5 for essentially just a few additional ships. But as somebody who likes fighting in carrier battles and having lots of stupid fighter furballs all over the board, for me it was worth it, and it's just nice to have, you know, as much as I can for the C4 races. Someday, I think we will have more for the C4 races. They're definitely popular enough to get all this additional support, and I think they brought the fracs over into Federation Commander. You can buy 3 E-packs of frac ships for that game system as well. So clearly there is demand for more content for these guys. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll still see C4F, C4R, and C4X in the future. But in any case, that's my super deep look at C4 and its sisterly products P6 and those issues of Starfleet Times. Probably far more exhaustive than it needed to be, but I really wanted to show off all the cool stuff you get in this product. If you really enjoy the tactical challenge of flying ships in SFB, then you can't go wrong with Module C4. There's just so much interesting stuff in there, new systems, new challenges. Fighting with or against these different ships and new empires is a really interesting challenge and a lot of fun. And of course, once you get something like this, it'll tend to fire up your imagination, and you may come up with really crazy new scenarios or new ship ideas or weapon ideas that you can then test out in the simulators for yourself. So highly recommended for fans of the system. Probably not worth getting if you're new to SFB. I would really get stuck into the basic and advanced sets first and the new empires in C1, C2, C3. But then once you're really looking for a new challenge or to mix things up on a regular SFB gaming night, then definitely pull these guys out. Challenge your local Romulan shark to a match against the shark hunters, see how they stand up, and have a good old time. So I hope that was useful. If you have any more questions about these modules or about the simulator races in general, hit me up in the comments. Happy to talk more about these if there's any way I can be helpful. I will have some more deep dive reviews of my favorite modules coming out in the future, so look out for those. And if there's any particular modules that you want to see, let me know, and I'll try to prioritize things in a way that helps you out. After this one, I want to do C6 and then probably C5, and then I'm going to look at Omega, but I'm happy to change up the order if you have requests. So in the meantime, have fun. Good luck flying your starships or whatever else you're doing. Stay happy, healthy, and well, and I hope to see you in a future video. All right, take care, and bye-bye.